In this figure, we want to look at the conducting pathways for cardiac action potentials as they travel throughout the atrial and ventricular syncytia. In other words, the atrial cells are all connected and the ventricular cells are all connected in functional syncytia. The atria would be found at the top here and the ventricles at the bottom. Now, our pacemaker is generally found in the SA node, right? That's where we get our action potential generation that allows for the coordination and activation of all other heart muscle cells to contract. This is true and only true because the SA node contains nodal cells that are the fastest to spontaneously depolarize. There are other spontaneously depolarizing cells of the conducting pathways. They're just slower to do so and therefore are driven by the SA node. Once the SA node fires and generates an action potential, we would get depolarizing current into adjacent cells, which would generate their own action potentials, and then depolarizing current into adjacent cells, and those would generate action potentials. And so it's sort of like dominoes falling in sequence, right, throughout our atrial muscle tissue up here. One of those pathways, we'd call those internodal pathways, would lead to the atrioventricular node. The AV node is found at the bottom of the right atrium. The SA node is found at the top of the right atrium. This AV node functions to slow the signal, slow the conveyance of the stimulation into the ventricles. It does so by possessing fewer gap junctions between adjacent cells. That actually slows the action potential propagation along these pathways. So we get this action potential delay. It is also the only place where we're actually going to convey the signal from the atrial syncytia down into the ventricular syncytia. This is true because of the presence of the fibrous skeleton. This is connective tissue that contains no gap junctions, and therefore we cannot passively pass the depolarizing action potentials across this fibrous skeleton. This pathway does not exist. And that's important because if that did happen, we would stimulate our ventricles to contract out of order too soon and in an anatomical pathway that would not be adapted for optimal pressure generation and ejection of blood. So instead, it comes through the AV node, we get a delay. Then the same thing happens in the ventricular syncytia. We get depolarizing current across our gap junctions, right? And our cells fall like dominoes. And what we find is that we send our signal down the interventricular septum here, all the way to the apex of the heart down here at the bottom. And then, of course, it's going to travel up the walls in the right and left ventricles here. That's adaptive because what it means is that we're actually going to contract the ventricles from bottom up, from apex toward the base. This is important because our arterial outlets into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk are actually at the top toward the base of the heart. And so we pressurize that blood by squeezing it from bottom to top and eject the blood into those cardiovascular circuits.